A single lie sealed a man's fate, but Holmes sees the fracture beneath it. Welcome to Sherlock Holmes. I am your host, Julian Whitmore. Tell me where you're watching from today. Your voice matters. I'm grateful for every comment. Let's begin. It was in the closing days of October, when the yellow fog lay thick upon Baker Street and the lamps shone like blurred moons through the damp, that a case came to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, which even now returns to Dr. Watson's mind with a peculiar chill. The public, to whom the great detective's exploits are too often reduced to a catalogue of triumphs, has little notion of the near failures that sharpened his genius. Nor can it readily picture a London where a man might be hurried from accusation to sentence with a swiftness as pitiless as the turn of a wheel. Then Holmes had passed an unusually languid morning. He lounged by the fire with his long, nervous fingers steepled beneath his chin, while his keen grey eyes followed the slow gyrations of tobacco smoke that rose from his pipe and vanished among the ceiling shadows. Watson, seated with a medical journal, found his attention repeatedly stolen by the familiar contrast between Holmes's indolent repose and the latent energy which, at the first spark of mystery, could set his whole being aflame. A sharp ring at the bell, followed by Mrs. Hudson's hurried step, broke the quiet. She ushered in Inspector Lestrade, his narrow face pinched and his ferret eyes bright with bad news. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes. Doctor," said he. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's a matter. Well, it's a hanging matter, so if you take my meaning." Holmes's eyelids lifted a fraction. "Pray continue, Lestrade. The phrase suggests that you are either a poet or in trouble." "In trouble, then," returned the inspector. "A man's been condemned at the Old Bailey. Sentence passed yesterday. Execution set for Monday at 8. Watson laid down his journal. "So soon?" "It's the way of it when the evidence is plain and the public's blood is up," said Lestrade. "The victim was a gentleman of standing. The papers have been baying for a rope since the day it happened." Holmes leaned forward, the languor falling from him like a cloak. "Name the victim." "Mr. Percival Hatherley, of Brookside House, Hampstead. Found dead in his study 3 weeks ago. Throat cut. No robbery. No sign of a stranger entering." The servants heard nothing. "But there was a witness, Mr. J. Holmes, a witness and a written confession." "A confession?" Holmes's voice was suddenly very soft. Lestrade nodded and drew from his pocket a folded sheet, creased by many consultations. Signed and dated, left on the desk beside the body. "I, Elias Crowe, take full responsibility." It goes on to say he was driven by jealousy, that Hatherley had ruined him, and that he deserved death. Crowe was taken within the hour. He'd blood on his cuffs, and he was seen leaving the grounds. He made no defense, only said he would not have his words twisted, and that the truth was written. Watson watched Holmes' face as the detective's eyes ran over the paper. There was no start, no exclamation, only the tightening of the lips and a faint deepening of the lines about the nostrils which Watson had learned to associate with concealed interest. "And you," said Holmes at last, "are satisfied?" Lestrade's shoulders rose and fell. "It's as neat as a case can be. Motive, opportunity, confession, and a witness to place him there. Yet there's something that sticks in my throat. Crowe is no fool. He's a clerk by trade, steady as they come, with a wife and a child in Islington. He had quarrelled with Hatherley, true enough, over some investment scheme. But when I saw him in the dock, he looked like a man already dead." Holmes returned the paper. "You have developed a conscience, Lestrade. Call it what you will," snapped the inspector. "If the sentence is carried out and we've hanged the wrong man, it won't sit well. And there's another thing. This morning a woman came to me. Lady Margaret Hatherley. She swears her brother had no enemies but those he made with his tongue, and that Elias Crowe was more likely to beg than to kill. She asked me to bring it to you. She said you were the only man in London who could find the lie." Holmes' eyes flashed at the last word. "The lie, you say?" a lie that sent an innocent man to the gallows, murmured Watson, for the phrase had fallen from Lestrade with a force that chilled the room. Holmes rose and paced to the window, peering out at the blur of hansoms and streaming pavement. "There is a peculiar satisfaction," said he slowly, "in tearing away a falsehood that has been accepted as truth. Still, if the machinery of justice has already turned, we shall have little time to wedge a spanner into it." "Will you take it?" Lestrade asked, and for once there was appeal in his manner. Holmes turned, and the old sardonic smile touched his lips. "My dear Lestrade, and when you come to me with a confession that is too complete, a witness that is too prompt, and a hanging that is too near, you tempt me. Tell Lady Margaret that I shall call upon her this afternoon. Meanwhile, Dr. Watson will put on his boots. We go to Hampstead." Within the hour, we were rattling northward through the wet streets, the wheels of our hansom hissing upon the stones. Holmes sat hunched in the narrow seat, silent, his chin sunk into the collar of his coat. Watson watched the blurred shop fronts slide past like phantoms. Lestrade rode upon the box, eager to keep hold of a case which had begun to trouble even him. "Tell me of this witness," Holmes said at last. "A gardener, Caleb Pritchard," Lestrade answered. "He was by the South Walk, and about 9:15 he saw Crow come out from the French windows of the study and cross the lawn. Crow looked wild, he says, and kept his hands in his pockets. Pritchard challenged him, but Crow hurried on through the gate. The housekeeper found the body at 9 when she brought in the post." Holmes gave a low, incredulous sound. "A gardener who is at the Laurels at 9:15 in late October and claims clear sight in fog. Curious." "He's a steady fellow," Lestrade insisted. 15 years with the family." "So are some false witnesses," murmured Holmes. Brookside House was a broad villa half smothered in shrubs, with a sweep of gravel and a porticoed door. A grave footman admitted us, and led us to a drawing-room where a coal fire fought the damp. Lady Margaret Hatherley awaited us there, tall and rigid in mourning, where the red rims of her eyes betrayed sleeplessness, yet her voice held itself steady. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "they will kill that man on Monday." Holmes inclined his head. "Madame, then we must hurry. When did you last see your brother alive?" "At dinner the evening before," she answered promptly. Percival was irritable. He had quarrelled with Mr. Crow that afternoon. I heard raised voices in the study. "About money?" Watson asked. "Yes. My brother invested through a syndicate Mr. Crow recommended. It failed. Percival accused him of deceit." "Was Crow alone?" Holmes's eyes were upon her hands, and not her face. His wife waited in the hall, a pale little woman. She begged my brother to be gentle. He was not. "And after Crow left?" "My brother wrote letters. He rang for tea at 10. The maid brought it. He dismissed her. That is all." Holmes's glance travelled round the room. He paused at a photograph on the mantel and touched the frame. "Your brother shot left-handed," he observed. Lady Margaret started. "How could you know that?" "The powder smudge upon the frame is on the left side, and the pistol in the picture is held in the left hand," said Holmes. "It may matter later. Now I should like the study and the servants in the order in which they found and handled things, and I should like the confession as it lay." "They took it away," she said. "So they always do," Holmes replied. "Then we must read the room." We were led along a corridor smelling of polish and damp wool to the study where Mr. Percival Hatherley had met his end. Tall French windows looked upon the garden. A massive oak desk stood beneath a green-shaded lamp. Books lined the walls, and a decanter and glasses sat upon a sideboard. The desk, with its blotter and scattered letters, seemed to hold the last posture of its owner. Holmes stood motionless for a full minute, his eyes making those tiny, rapid excursions which Watson had learned to associate with intense thought. "At what time was the body removed?" he asked. "Same day," Lestrade said. Coroner's men. Who opened the windows? The housekeeper, Lady Margaret replied. She said the air was foul. Holmes went to the French windows, examined the latch, and then dropped to his knees to run his fingers along the inner sill. When he rose, there was a smear of dark upon his glove. Garden soil, he said. Not remarkable, except that it is inside. Lestrade shrugged. A man could step in from the lawn. A man could, Holmes agreed. A man could also step out. But a dead man does neither. Now, where was the paper? Lady Margaret pointed to the blotter. There. Holmes sniffed the inkstand, lifted the blotting paper, and revealed a faint indentation as if a sheet had been pressed hard upon the wood. Someone wrote here with determination, he murmured, and afterwards tried to make the desk appear untouched. He crossed to the grate, stirred the grey ashes delicately, and drew out a half-burnt scrap. Watson could make out only the tail of a word, monde, and the flourish of a signature. Holmes pocketed it without a glance at Lestrade. "Madame," he said, "did your brother have an enemy whose hatred was more personal than money?" Lady Margaret's chin lifted. "My brother had many acquaintances and few friends. He could be cruel. But murder, no, is not in this house." Holmes's gaze fell upon a small vase on the desk, where a single white chrysanthemum drooped. He bent close. For an instant, a glint of satisfaction crossed his face. "Not in this house," he repeated softly, "and yet the lie was written here. Dr. Lestrade, let us speak with the gardener who trims laurels in fog at once, before dusk." Caleb Pritchard was discovered behind a belt of damp laurels bordering the south walk, his shears moving with slow precision as though each leaf bore personal offense. He was a square-built fellow of 50, with a weather-reddened face and a pair of pale eyes, which shifted too quickly for my liking when he perceived our approach. "You are the gardener?" Holmes inquired pleasantly. "Yes, sir. 15-year come Candlemas." "You were on duty here upon the morning of Mr. Hatherley's death?" Pritchard wiped his hands upon his corduroys. "I was, sir, by the south path, as I told the police." "At 8:45. "Aye, sir." Holmes glanced at the sky, which even now, near noon, wore a thin grey veil. "You have admirable eyesight, Mr. Pritchard. The fog that morning was thick." "It were lifting by then," the gardener replied quickly. "You could see a fair way." Indeed. Holmes stepped toward the French windows of the study, which from that vantage lay some 30 yards distant across the lawn. "From here, can you discern the latch upon those windows?" Pritchard peered, hesitated, and shook his head. "Not the latch, sir. Yet you could identify Mr. Crow's expression." The man's jaw tightened. "He looked wild," I said. "Any man could see that." Holmes's tone remained mild. "Describe his coat." "Dark coat. Brown, I think." "Crow owns a black coat and a grey," Lestrade interjected. "No brown." Pritchard flushed beneath his ruddy skin. "It were dark, that's what I meant." Holmes's eyes travelled downward. "Your boots, Mr. Pritchard." The gardener stared. "My boots, sir. They are heavily clotted with clay, fresh clay, yet the lawn between here and the study is gravel-edged and well-drained. Pray show me where you stood." Reluctantly, the man led us along the path. Holmes examined the ground with care. The earth beneath the laurels was indeed soft, but there were no clear impressions, save those newly made by Pritchard's own tread. "You challenged Crow?" Holmes continued. "I did. Asked him what he was about." "And he replied?" "He said naught, just hurried off." "Through which gate?" "The side gate to the lane." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "Now that gate has been locked these 3 weeks. The key hangs in the scullery." Lestrade uttered a short exclamation. Pritchard's lips parted, then he recovered himself. "It were unlocked that day." Holmes turned without further comment and paced toward the French windows. He examined the gravel border, crouched, and with a penknife lifted a small fragment from between 2 stones. Watson saw that it was a sliver of white petal, crushed and ground into the grit. Holmes rose. "Mr. Pritchard, do you cultivate chrysanthemums?" "Aye, sir, along the east wall." "And do you bring them into the study?" "No, sir. The housekeeper cuts for the vases." Holmes inclined his head. "Thank you. Remain at your duties." When we had withdrawn a little way, Lestrade seized Holmes by the sleeve. "You think he lies?" Holmes's expression was one of quiet absorption. "He embellishes at the least. The gate was locked. His description of Crow's coat is faulty, and he speaks of fog lifting at an hour when, by all accounts, it lay thick until near 10. Moreover, the soil upon the inner sill of the study was of a heavier, reddish quality than that in this border. It resembles rather the clay of the east beds." "You mean he came from the other side of the house?" Watson asked. "I mean," said Holmes, "that someone carried garden soil into the study, and that someone crushed a chrysanthemum upon the gravel outside. Yet the flower in the vase within is white and unblemished." We re-entered the house by the main door. Holmes requested the presence of the housekeeper, a prim woman named Mrs. Dalton, whose agitation betrayed both grief and apprehension. "You found the body?" Holmes asked gently. "Yes, sir. At 9 precisely. I had the post on my tray." "The windows, were they open?" "No, sir. Closed fast. I opened them after I saw." "Did you touch the desk?" I moved the paper to read it." "Before the police arrived?" "Yes, sir." Holmes' gaze softened almost imperceptibly. "And the vase?" "The flower had fallen. I set it upright again." "Ah." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. "Had it fallen upon the blotter?" "I believe so, sir." Holmes dismissed her with courtesy. As we stood once more in the study, he approached the desk and placed his fingers lightly upon the polished surface. "The indentation upon the blotter was made by a firm hand," he said in a low voice. "Yet the confession, as copied by Lestrade, bears a tremor inconsistent with such pressure. The burnt fragment in the grate suggests a prior document, perhaps a letter begun and destroyed." "You suspect the confession was forged?" Lestrade demanded. "I suspect," Holmes replied, "that it was written under circumstances other than those presented in court, and I suspect that our gardener's tale serves to seal that impression." Watson felt the air of the room grow close once more. Beyond the windows, the laurels stirred in a faint wind, their glossy leaves whispering. "Then Crow may yet be innocent," I said. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "If he is, Doctor, we have less than 4 days to prove it. Let us now seek the man whose neck waits upon our deductions." Before quitting Brookside House, Holmes made a final circuit of the grounds, pausing longest by the east wall where the chrysanthemums grew in ordered ranks. The soil here was markedly different from that of the South Walk, heavier, tinged with red, and clinging tenaciously to the roots. Holmes stooped and pressed a finger into it, then compared the smear upon his glove with that which he had taken from the study sill. He said nothing, yet the faint tightening of his features told me that the resemblance was exact. "It is a singular thing, Watson," he remarked as we regained the carriage, "how often the earth betrays what men strive to conceal. A footprint, a stain, a crushed petal, each is a syllable in the language of truth." Lestrade, who had followed our movements with impatience, leaned forward. "Then you believe Pritchard entered the study?" "I believe he approached it," Holmes replied. "Whether before or after Mr. Hatherley's death remains to be seen. But if the gardener lied, we must ask why. Loyalty? Fear? Or something more personal?" Our destination was Holloway Jail, where Elias Crow awaited his fate. The grim facade of the prison rose against the dull sky like a monument to finality. Holmes's manner, as we were shown into a narrow visitor's room divided by iron bars, became curiously restrained. He folded his long fingers and watched the door through which the condemned man would enter. Crow was of middle height, spare and pale, with the stoop of one accustomed to desks rather than fields. His eyes, though ringed with fatigue, were steady. When he perceived Holmes, a flicker of recognition passed across his face. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said quietly. "I had thought perhaps you would come." Holmes inclined his head. "You have little time, Mr. Crow. If there is truth to be told, but now is the hour." Crow's hands gripped the bars. "I wrote what was found upon the desk." "You admit the confession?" "I do." Watson felt a sinking of the heart, yet Holmes's expression did not alter. "Under what circumstances was it written?" he asked. "In anger," Crow replied. "Hatherley taunted me. He said I had ruined him, that I had cheated him. I told him I would take responsibility for the loss, though it was the market that failed, not I. He mocked me. I said I would put it in writing if that would ease his pride." "You wrote such a document there and then?" "Yes, at his desk, before his death." Crow hesitated. "He was alive when I left." Lestrade leaned forward sharply. "Yet the note speaks of murder." "I did not write that part," Crow said, and for the first time emotion broke through his composure. "I wrote that I bore responsibility for his financial ruin. I did not confess to killing him." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Describe precisely what you wrote." Crow closed his eyes as if summoning the scene. "I began, I, Elias Crow, take full responsibility for the losses incurred by Mr. Percival Hatherley in the matter of the Argentine Railway shares." I signed my name. He snatched the paper, read it, and laughed. He said it would serve him well. I left then. "At what hour?" "Near 8. It was dark and the fog thick." "Did you encounter the gardener?" "No. I went by the front gate." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "You're aware that a witness places you leaving by the French windows at 9:15. Crow's brow furrowed. "That is false?" "I never crossed the lawn." "Why then, when arrested, did you not deny the confession outright?" Crow's voice sank. "Because my words were there. I feared they would twist them. I believed that if I said little, the truth would show itself." Holmes's gaze grew intent. "Mr. Crow, were you left-handed?" "No." "Was Mr. Hatherley?" "Yes. He boasted of it when he shot." Holmes rose. "One final question. Did you notice any flowers upon the desk?" Crow looked puzzled. "A white chrysanthemum in a vase. He had a fondness for them." Holmes bowed slightly. "That will suffice. For now." As we left the prison, Lestrade broke out, "If he speaks true, the confession was altered after he wrote it." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "The indentation upon the blotter showed firm pressure consistent with an untroubled hand. The tremor in the copied text suggests later additions under strain. Moreover, the burnt fragment in the grate bore the tale of Monde, likely Argentine. Then someone destroyed the original letter and substituted another," Watson said. "Or appended to it," Holmes corrected. "A most economical deceit." Lestrade frowned. "But to what end? Crow's quarrel gave motive enough. Why risk forgery?" Holmes' eyes were distant as the carriage bore us back toward Baker Street. "Because motive may be redirected. Consider, a financial loss, a public quarrel, a convenient confession. Add to this a gardener whose testimony is unreliable and soil that travels where it should not. We are confronted not with a crime of passion, but with arrangement." "Arrangement by whom?" I asked. Holmes's thin smile returned. "By the individual who stood to gain most from Mr. Hatherley's death, and from Crow's silence. We must examine the victim's affairs with the same care we have given his garden. Only then shall we see whose hand pruned more than laurels." Holmes did not return at once to Baker Street, but directed the cabman toward Lincoln's Inn Fields, where Mr. Percival Hatherley's solicitors maintained their offices. The decision was characteristic. While Lestrade concerned himself with persons, Holmes pursued documents. "The dead man's papers will tell us what the living conceal," he observed. "If Hatherley's ruin was recent and severe, we must learn who profited by it." We were received by Mr. Anstruther, a dry and parchment-faced gentleman whose air of professional composure faltered when Holmes mentioned the impending execution. "It is a most lamentable affair," said he. My client's affairs were complicated." "In what respect?" Holmes asked. "Mr. Hatherley speculated beyond his means. The Argentine railway shares were but one venture. There were others, equally unfortunate." "Did he insure his life?" Mr. Anstruther blinked. "Why, yes. A substantial policy, though taken some years ago." "In whose favor?" "In favor of his sister, Lady Margaret. There are no other close relations." Holmes's brows rose slightly. "And his will?" "Executed 5 years since. The estate passes to Lady Margaret, absolutely." Watson saw Lestrade's head jerk at this intelligence, yet Holmes betrayed no overt reaction. "Was Mr. Hatherley solvent at the time of his death?" he continued. The solicitor hesitated. "Not entirely. Certain creditors pressed him. Indeed, I had urged retrenchment. Among those creditors was Mr. Elias Crowe?" "No, Mr. Crowe was not his creditor. If anything, Mr. Hatherley believed himself wronged by Mr. Crowe." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And did Mr. Hatherley make any recent alterations to his will?" "None." Holmes thanked him and rose. As we stepped once more into the damp afternoon, Lestrade burst out, "There's motive enough in that policy. If the sister inherits, she stands to gain by his death." Holmes' expression was reflective. "True. Yet one must not leap where one may step. Lady Margaret summoned us. It is a bold murderer who invites scrutiny." "Boldness and innocence are not the same," Lestrade retorted. Holmes smiled faintly. "Quite so. That is why we shall examine her boldness." We returned to Brookside House as twilight gathered. Lady Margaret received us again, her composure unshaken. Madame," Holmes began without preamble, "were you aware of your brother's financial distress?" "I knew he speculated," she replied. "He would not confide the details." "You are his sole heir." "That is so. And the beneficiary of a considerable insurance policy." A flicker crossed her face. Annoyance, perhaps, rather than surprise. "You suspect me." "I suspect everyone, madam, until the facts absolve them." She drew herself up. "If I had wished my brother dead, I need not have forged a confession." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "You speak as though forgery were established." "I speak," she said coolly, "as one who reads the newspapers. They already question the evidence." Holmes paced slowly across the carpet. "Where were you at 9:15 on the morning of your brother's death?" "In the breakfast room. Mrs. Dalton can attest it." "And did you see Mr. Crowe depart the house the previous evening?" "I did not. I had withdrawn." Holmes stopped before the mantel where the photograph stood. "Your brother shot left-handed, yet the wound in his throat, as described at the inquest, was drawn from left to right." Lady Margaret's colour ebbed. "What do you imply?" "That if he cut his own throat, the motion would more naturally run from right to left. The direction suggests a right-handed assailant standing before him." Lestrade stared. "The jury never considered suicide." "Because," Holmes said, "the confession diverted them, but we must consider all." Lady Margaret's voice trembled despite her effort. "My brother would never—" "I agree," Holmes interrupted gently. "The cut was too clean and too deliberate for self-infliction under such circumstances. Yet the handedness remains significant." He moved to the desk and lifted the vase. "Who placed this chrysanthemum here?" "I did," she answered after a pause. "It was cut that morning." "Before the body was found?" "Yes." Holmes set the vase down with care. "The petal crushed upon the gravel outside corresponds to this bloom. Yet Mrs. Dalton states it had fallen and was replaced. Therefore, it fell before the police arrived. Why should a flower fall unless the desk were disturbed?" Lady Margaret's eyes widened. "You think someone struggled here?" Not violently, Holmes replied, but enough to displace a vase. Silence stretched between us. At last she said, "What do you intend, Mr. Holmes?" "To prevent an injustice," he answered, "and to discover who profited most by transforming a statement of financial responsibility into a confession of murder." As we departed, Holmes's face was grave. "Watson," he said quietly, "we stand upon the edge of a deception constructed with care. The soil, the flower, the altered document, the gardener's lie. Each thread leads inward, not outward. Tomorrow we shall pull them together. For if Crow is innocent, the true hand that guided the pen and the knife remains within these walls." Holmes was astir before dawn, and by the time I had dressed, he had already dispatched 2 telegrams and consumed a solitary cup of black coffee. His violin lay neglected upon the chair. Instead, the blotter at our own table bore the marks of intense activity. "You perceive, Watson," he said without looking up, "that we are confronted by 3 central alterations: the modification of a document, the displacement of a flower, and the misdirection of a witness. Such harmony of adjustment argues design." "And the designer?" I asked. "Must be one who possessed opportunity, composure, and a right hand." He folded the telegram form and slipped it into his pocket. "Come, we shall revisit Brookside House before breakfast concludes." Lady Margaret received us with a stiffness that bordered upon defiance. Holmes requested, with polite firmness, that all servants be assembled in the dining room. Presently, Mrs. Dalton, the footman, 2 maids, and Caleb Pritchard stood in a nervous row. Holmes addressed them quietly. "I shall trouble you with a few precise questions. Mrs. Dalton, at what hour did you cut the chrysanthemum placed in the study?" "About 8, answer. I took it from the east wall." "Did you enter the study then?" "Yes, sir. Mr. Hatherley was at his desk." "Alone?" "Yes." "And Mr. Crow had already departed?" "He had left earlier, sir. I did not see him." Holmes nodded and turned to the footman. "You admitted Mr. Crow that afternoon?" "Yes, sir." "Did he carry any bag or parcel?" "No, sir." Holmes' gaze shifted to Pritchard. "Mr. Pritchard, you were in the East Beds at what hour that morning?" The gardener hesitated. Why, at 7:30, sir." "Indeed? And you passed the study windows?" "No, sir. I remained at the wall." Holmes's eyes flickered. "Yet the soil from those beds was later found upon the inner sill of the study. Can you account for that?" Pritchard's face mottled. "I cannot, sir." Holmes dismissed the servants save Lady Margaret and Pritchard, so the air in the room grew charged. "Mr. Pritchard," Holmes resumed, "you testified that you saw Mr. Crow exit by the French windows at 9:15. You described his coat inaccurately and asserted a gate was open which is customarily locked. I now ask you plainly, whom did you truly see?" The gardener's jaw worked. He glanced at Lady Margaret, whose expression remained composed but intent. "I saw a man," he muttered. "Which man?" Silence. Holmes stepped closer. "You are loyal, perhaps, but loyalty does not extend to the gallows. If an innocent man dies, you bear part of the burden." Pritchard's shoulders sagged. "I saw someone at the window," he burst out. "Not Crow. I thought at first it were the master himself, but he moved strangely. I did not wish trouble." "Describe him," Holmes said sharply. "He wore dark clothes." As he stood by the desk. Then he bent as if writing. "Later I saw him cross the lawn. The fog were thick, but I knew it weren't Crow. Crow had left long before." Lestrade, who had joined us silently, drew a sharp breath. "Why did you not say so?" Pritchard swallowed. "Because I were told it were Crow, and because—" His eyes flicked again to Lady Margaret. Holmes followed the glance. "Because someone instructed you to be certain." Lady Margaret's voice cut in, cool as steel. "You overstep, Mr. Holmes." "On the contrary," Holmes replied. I proceed with caution. Mr. Pritchard, who spoke with you before the inquest? The master's sister, he whispered. Watson felt a tightening in his chest. Lady Margaret's composure faltered for the first time. I advised him to tell what he believed he saw, she said. So nothing more. Holmes's gaze was relentless. Belief shaped by suggestion is a pliant thing. Now, madam, I must ask you to write a sentence for me. Her eyes widened. What sentence? Holmes produced a sheet of paper. Write, I, Elias Crowe, take full responsibility. Nothing further. For a moment, she seemed about to refuse. Then, with a swift motion, she took the pen and wrote. Her hand was steady, the strokes firm. Holmes placed the paper beside the copy of the confession he had obtained from Lestrade. He compared the pressure, the angle of the letters, the distinctive flourish upon the capital I. Watson saw his expression change from scrutiny to certainty. The resemblance is striking, Holmes said quietly, particularly in the formation of the R and the terminal sweep of the Y. Lady Margaret rose abruptly. You cannot prove? Holmes raised a hand. I can prove that the original document, written by Crowe, concerned financial responsibility alone. It was later amended by a right-handed writer who stood before the desk, displacing the vase. The amended text introduced the language of murder. The gardener, seeing a figure at the window in fog, was persuaded to identify Crowe, and the insurance policy ensured that upon your brother's death, his debts would be erased and his estate secured. Her face had drained of color. You're mad. On the contrary, Holmes replied softly. I am precise. Your brother discovered the extent of his ruin and perhaps intended to alter his will. A quarrel with Crowe provided the perfect scaffold upon which to hang both a lie and a man. Lestrade stepped forward. Lady Margaret Hatherley, I must ask you to accompany me. She stood rigid, then sank back into her chair, the pen falling from her fingers. As we departed, Holmes's expression was grave rather than triumphant. There remains one final corroboration, he murmured. But unless I am gravely mistaken, Watson, the lie has been found, and the rope shall not claim Elias Crowe. Lestrade did not place Lady Margaret under arrest at once. Holmes, with that curious restraint which often marked the final movements of his strategy, requested a single day's delay. The inspector, though visibly eager to close his hand upon the matter, yielded to Holmes's insistence that conjecture must harden into proof before the law could act without peril. You have shown resemblance of hand, Lestrade said as we quitted Brookside House. But resemblance is not conviction. Quite so, Holmes replied. We must demonstrate sequence as well as similarity. The Crown secured its case upon the confession. If we unravel that thread in open court, the rest will follow. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes immediately set about arranging what he termed his final corroboration. He dispatched a note to Mr. Anstruther requesting access to Mr. Hatherley's recent correspondence, and another to the Governor of Holloway, seeking a brief reprieve upon the ground of fresh evidence. By evening, replies had arrived to both. The solicitor consented to our inspection the following morning. The governor, with bureaucratic reluctance, agreed to a temporary stay pending inquiry. Thus, Elias Crowe gained, by Holmes's intervention, 2 precious days. At 10 o'clock next morning, we sat in Mr. Anstruther's office amid bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. Holmes handled them with the delicacy of a surgeon. Observe, Watson, he murmured, spreading several sheets upon the desk. Mr. Hatherley's hand, bold, leftward slanting, the pressure heaviest at the commencement of each stroke. Compare it with this. He produced the confession copy and Lady Margaret's specimen. Though the writing differed in character, certain peculiarities, particularly the angular capital letters and the downward thrust of the final strokes, were unmistakable. She learned her script beside her brother's, I ventured. Precisely. A family resemblance in penmanship is common. Yet here the imitation is conscious. Note how the pressure increases unnaturally upon the phrase deserved death. That clause was appended. Holmes then requested from Mr. Anstruther any draft wills or memoranda prepared by the deceased in recent weeks. After some searching, the solicitor produced a folded paper dated 3 days before the murder. Holmes read swiftly, his eyes brightening. As I suspected, Mr. Hatherley intended to revise his will. He writes of establishing a trust to shield the estate from speculative loss and of limiting his sister's immediate control. Lestrade, who had joined us, uttered a low whistle. If he signed that, she would not have inherited outright. Just so, Holmes replied. The motive sharpens. But motive and forged writing are still not the knife, Lestrade objected. Holmes smiled thinly. Then let us consider the knife. From his pocket, he withdrew a small envelope containing a scrap of stiff paper. This fragment was taken from the grate, and you perceive the tail of Monde and the flourish consistent with Mr. Hatherley's signature. It is from a letter addressed to Argentum and Company, the brokers. The paper bears the watermark used exclusively in this house. Lestrade nodded. And, Holmes continued, the burn is partial. It was thrust into embers not yet fully hot. That suggests haste following disturbance. He leaned back. Picture the scene. Mr. Hatherley quarrels with Crowe. Crowe departs, leaving a written admission of financial responsibility. Later, Mr. Hatherley begins drafting a letter, perhaps to his brokers, perhaps concerning alteration of his affairs. Lady Margaret, aware of his intention to curtail her inheritance, confronts him. In the struggle that follows, she seizes the paper knife, which was never found. Lestrade interjected. It was returned to its stand, Holmes replied calmly. A narrow blade, suitable for the wound described. Being right-handed, she draws it across his throat from left to right. The vase is overturned. In the confusion, she perceives Crowe's document upon the desk. An inspiration presents itself. She amends the text, adding the confession of murder, and destroys the draft letter which might expose her motive. The gardener glimpses her silhouette through fog. Later, she guides his recollection. Lestrade paced the room. It is neat, too neat. Holmes' eyes flashed. Then let us add the final stone, the ink. He produced a small vial. From the study inkstand I obtained a sample. From Lady Margaret's writing desk, another. The former is a common blue-black. The latter, a rarer iron gall mixture with a distinct metallic sheen. Is under magnification, the appended words in the confession display that sheen. Crowe's original lines do not. Lestrade stopped short. You tested them? With a simple reagent, the difference is unmistakable. Silence settled as the implications crystallized. Then it is complete, Lestrade said slowly. We have altered ink, altered hand, suppressed will, and a witness swayed. Holmes inclined his head. Complete enough to act. That afternoon we returned once more to Brookside House. Lady Margaret received us in the study where the tragedy had occurred. The desk stood as before, only the absence of its master lent it an air of accusation. Holmes placed the 2 ink samples upon the surface. Madame, I regret to press you further. Yet science has no sympathy. The appended confession was written with ink from your desk, not your brother's. Her composure fractured. You cannot prove, Holmes interrupted gently. I can demonstrate it before any chemist in London. Combined with your brother's draft, will, and Mr. Pritchard's revised testimony, the case is no longer conjecture. Lestrade stepped forward. Lady Margaret Hatherley, I must formally charge you with the murder of your brother, Percival Hatherley, and with perverting the course of justice. For a moment she stood motionless, then her shoulders sagged. The proud carriage dissolved into something smaller, more human. He would have ruined us both, she whispered. He meant to cast me aside, to leave me dependent. And so you cast him aside instead, Holmes said quietly. As Lestrade led her away, I turned to Holmes. His face bore no triumph, only a grave stillness. Crow? I asked. None. He shall be freed before the week ends, Holmes replied. But the shadow of the scaffold lingers long. That is the true cruelty of a lie. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, does not easily reverse its course, yet when confronted with evidence as clear as that which Holmes laid before the authorities, it must, however reluctantly, alter its direction. By the following morning, the newspapers, which had so recently clamored for Elias Crow's execution, carried instead the astonishing announcement of Lady Margaret Hatherley's arrest and the suspension of the sentence. Holmes received the news with a quiet nod and no outward sign of satisfaction. The public, he remarked as he folded the Times upon his knee, is ever eager for certainty. It matters little to it whether that certainty be founded upon truth. We attended the preliminary hearing 2 days later. The courtroom was crowded to suffocation, the air thick with anticipation and the restless whispering of those who sensed that they had been deceived. Crow, pale but upright, stood once more before the bench, this time no longer as a condemned man, but as the central figure in an unfolding reversal. Holmes was called to present his findings. I've seldom seen him more composed. He spoke without flourish, each point delivered in that clear, incisive tone which carried effortlessly through the chamber. He began with the confession, demonstrating by comparison of hands and by chemical analysis that the incriminating clauses had been appended in ink distinct from that used in Crow's original statement. He explained the indentation upon the blotter, showing that the pressure of the first writing was firm and unhesitating, whereas the later editions bore tremor and altered stroke. He then described the displaced chrysanthemum and the soil upon the inner sill, soil matching precisely that of the east beds, where Lady Margaret alone had passed that morning after Mrs. Dalton cut the flower. He recounted Pritchard's revised testimony, establishing that the figure glimpsed through the fog had been assumed, not identified, and that suggestion had supplied what certainty lacked. Finally, he produced Mr. Hatherley's draft memorandum of a revised will. The courtroom stirred audibly at the revelation that the deceased had intended to limit his sister's inheritance. Thus, Holmes concluded, that we observe motive in the threatened alteration of fortune, opportunity in the private access to the study, and deliberate misdirection in the alteration of a document and the shaping of a witness's recollection. Mr. Crow's presence earlier that evening provided a scaffold upon which a false confession was constructed. The lie was precise, but not precise enough. The magistrate listened intently, and when Holmes resumed his seat, there was a perceptible shift in the atmosphere. Lady Margaret, brought forward under guard, no longer exhibited the hauteur which had once shielded her. Her counsel attempted a feeble protest, yet the accumulation of detail left little ground upon which to stand. Crow's release was ordered that same afternoon, pending formal exoneration. When he emerged into the grey light beyond the court, so his wife flung herself into his arms with a sob that seemed to release the tension of many days. Holmes observed the reunion from a short distance, his expression unreadable. "You have given him back his life," I said quietly. Holmes shook his head. "I have merely removed a falsehood. Life is another matter." Lestrade joined us, his manner curiously subdued. "You were right from the start," he admitted. "The confession was too neat." Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. Neatness in crime is a rarity. Human passions are seldom symmetrical. "And Lady Margaret?" I asked. "She will stand trial," Lestrade replied. "The evidence is strong." As we walked toward our cab, Holmes's gaze drifted back to the courthouse facade. "It is a melancholy reflection," he said, "that intellect may be turned as readily to deceit as to discovery. Lady Margaret possessed courage and composure in abundance. Had she directed them otherwise?" He did not finish the thought. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes resumed his violin at last. The music he drew from the instrument was low and contemplative, lacking the brisk triumph which sometimes followed a successful case. I understood then that what weighed upon him was not the unmasking of guilt, but the narrow margin by which innocence had been preserved. For had Lestrade not felt the prickle of unease, had Lady Margaret not uttered that fatal phrase about forgery, had Holmes not stooped to note a smear of soil or the angle of a stroke, Elias Crowe would have mounted the scaffold protesting a truth no one would hear. When at last Holmes laid aside his bow, he regarded the dying embers of the fire. "Watson," he said, "remember this case when next you are tempted to accept what appears self-evident. A lie, when buttressed by circumstance, may pass for fact with alarming ease." "And yet," I replied, "you have shown that it may also be undone." Holmes's eyes, reflective in the firelight, turned toward me. "Yes, but only by patience and by attention to the smallest deviation from the expected. The truth seldom shouts, it whispers." Outside, the fog crept once more along Baker Street, muffling the clatter of wheels and the murmur of the city. Within our rooms there was a sense not of triumph, but of quiet vigilance, as though the great game of deception and detection had merely paused, awaiting its next move. Though Elias Crowe had been released and the tide of suspicion irrevocably turned, the affair was not yet concluded. Holmes, and whose mind seldom relinquished a problem until every facet lay exposed, remained curiously intent in the days that followed Lady Margaret's arrest. "You perceive, Watson," he remarked on the third evening after the hearing, "that confession and motive, however compelling, are not the same as reconstruction. I would know precisely how the final act transpired." "You have already shown how she altered the document and guided the gardener," I observed. "Indeed. Yet the sequence of moments between quarrel and death must be fixed with the same clarity. A chain is strongest when each link is tested." Accordingly, at Holmes's request, Lestrade arranged for us to revisit Brookside House once more before it was sealed pending trial. The rooms had taken on a desolate air. Servants moved softly, as though afraid to disturb memories that clung to the walls. Holmes went at once to the study. The desk remained as before, though now stripped of personal effects. He stood before it in silence, then placed himself deliberately in the position where Mr. Hatherley had sat. "Crowe stands here," he said, indicating the opposite side. They quarrel. Crowe writes his statement and departs. Hatherley reads it and retains it upon the blotter. He moved to the hearth. Later, he drafts his letter regarding alteration of his will. He signs or nearly signs. Hence the fragment. At this juncture, Lady Margaret enters. "Do we know that she did so?" I asked. Holmes pointed to the carpet near the desk. "There was noted at the inquest a faint smear of mud upon this spot. It was dismissed as insignificant, and yet the pattern matched the narrow sole of a lady's walking shoe, not the broader tread of a man's boot." Lestrade nodded reluctantly. "I recall the mark." Holmes continued. "She confronts him. Words escalate. He may threaten to proceed with his new will. In anger or fear, she seizes the paper knife from its stand." He indicated the precise angle. Being right-handed, she stands slightly to his left. The blow is drawn across from left to right. The force is sufficient and immediate. A hush fell as the imagined scene seemed to gather substance. "Afterwards," Holmes went on, "there is shock, perhaps regret, but calculation swiftly follows. She notes Crowe's document. With admirable presence of mind, she adds the incriminating phrases. She burns the draft letter. In doing so, she drops ash upon the hearth, but does not fully consume the fragment." "And the flower?" I prompted. In leaning across the desk to amend the text, she displaces the vase. It falls, the chrysanthemum striking the blotter, and later the gravel when she opens the window to suggest escape. Lestrade frowned. Yet the window was found closed. "Precisely. She opened it briefly to cast suspicion outward, stepping perhaps onto the sill, hence the soil within. Then, reconsidering, She shut it again, preferring the narrative of departure through the lawn. In fog, a figure glimpsed becomes whatever one expects. We were interrupted by Mrs. Dalton, who had approached hesitantly. "Beg pardon, sir," she said, addressing Holmes. "There is something I omitted before. On that morning, when I carried in the post, I noticed her ladyship's glove upon the hall table, stained as if with ink. I thought nothing of it." Holmes's eyes lit faintly. "You washed it?" "Yes, sir." "Yet you recall the stain was fresh?" "Quite fresh." Holmes thanked her gravely. When she withdrew, he turned to Lestrade. "There, Inspector, is the final corroboration. The ink upon her glove corresponds with the iron gall mixture from her desk. In altering the confession, she stained herself, and in haste neglected to remove the evidence before morning." Lestrade exhaled slowly. "It is complete." Holmes inclined his head. "As complete as mortal inquiry permits." We left the house in the waning light. A cold wind stirred the laurels, and the east beds lay dark and still. For a moment, I felt a strange pity for the woman whose ambition had led her to such extremity. "Do you believe," I asked as we descended toward the gate, "that she acted solely from fear of financial loss?" Holmes considered. "Fear of loss, resentment of control, and perhaps long-standing rivalry. The seeds of violence are seldom sown in a single day, but the act itself was swift." "And Crow?" "He was a convenience," Holmes replied. "An unfortunate man whose quarrel supplied the perfect scaffold. Had his temperament been less restrained, he might have protested more vigorously. His very dignity aided the deception." As our carriage bore us back toward London, I reflected upon the precariousness of justice when reliant upon appearances. A single altered sentence, a suggested memory, a flower disturbed. These slight deviations had nearly ended a life. Holmes, gazing through the window at the drifting dusk, seemed to read my thoughts. "The law seeks certainty," he said quietly. "But certainty is often constructed. Our task is to dismantle it when it rests upon false premises." "And when we succeed?" I asked. He gave a faint shrug. "Then we restore balance, if only temporarily. The world does not grow less deceptive, Watson. It merely presents new variations." The lamps were being lit along Baker Street when we arrived. Holmes paused upon the threshold, his tall figure silhouetted against the glow. "The lie has been traced from its inception to its consequence," he said. "Tomorrow it will be laid bare before a jury. Let us hope that truth, once spoken plainly, proves more enduring than the falsehood that nearly prevailed." The trial of Lady Margaret Hatherley commenced under a pall of extraordinary public interest. And the same crowds who had once pressed forward to glimpse Elias Crow now gathered to behold the woman whose composure and breeding had so nearly secured his destruction. Holmes declined all invitation to public commentary, yet his presence in court was indispensable. The prosecution, fortified by Holmes's reconstruction, laid its case with methodical clarity. The altered confession, the divergence of ink, the draft memorandum of a revised will, the gardener's corrected testimony, and the ink-stained glove formed a chain which, link by link, tightened about the accused. Lady Margaret bore the proceedings with outward calm, though the rigid pride I had first observed in her had given way to a brittle stillness. When called upon to speak, she denied deliberate murder, but faltered when confronted with the chemical analysis of the ink and the physical demonstration of the wound's direction. Holmes, at the bench, illustrated with measured gestures how a right-handed stroke would produce precisely the incision described by the coroner. The defense endeavored to suggest that Mr. Hatherley might have attacked his sister and that she had acted in panic. Yet no mark upon her person corroborated such a struggle. Moreover, the calculated amendment of the document betrayed not frenzy but design. Crow himself testified briefly, recounting the quarrel and the writing of his original statement. His quiet dignity impressed the jury. When he described his silence at trial, his belief that truth would assert itself, I saw several among the panel shift uneasily, and after 3 days of testimony, the verdict was rendered: guilty of willful murder and of fabricating evidence to pervert justice. A murmur swept the courtroom, less triumphant than subdued. The judge, in pronouncing sentence of life imprisonment, spoke gravely of the peril of intellect divorced from conscience. Holmes listened without expression. Only when we had quitted the building and the heavy doors closed behind us did he draw a long breath. "It is done," I said. "Yes," he replied, "though done imperfectly." "Imperfectly, because no verdict restores the dead, nor wholly erases the shadow cast upon the innocent." That evening, Elias Crow called upon us at Baker Street. He entered hesitantly, hat in hand, as though uncertain whether he trespassed upon sanctity. His wife waited below. "I cannot repay you, Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice steady but charged with feeling. I had reconciled myself to the rope. Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "You reconciled yourself too readily, Mr. Crow. Innocence must assert itself more vigorously." Crow lowered his eyes. "I believe the evidence against me insurmountable." "Evidence," Holmes replied, "is often but the arrangement of facts. When that arrangement is false, it must be challenged." Crow extended his hand. Holmes took it briefly, then withdrew. "Live quietly," he said. "Speculation is a hazardous occupation." When our visitor had departed, I observed Holmes in the firelight. There was no elation in his bearing, only a contemplative reserve. "You have prevented a grave injustice," I ventured. Holmes shook his head faintly. "I have prevented one manifestation of it. Consider how nearly the machinery completed its course. A confession, a witness, a motive, each apparently sound. It required but the slightest additional pressure, and the deed would have been irrevocable." He rose and crossed to the window. The fog, ever faithful to London, lay once more upon the street, softening outlines and obscuring distance. "A lie," he continued, "possesses an insidious advantage. It may be fashioned to fit expectation. Truth, by contrast, must be discovered." "And yet," I said, "you discovered it." Holmes gave a short, almost impatient gesture. "Because it deviated. The soil upon the sill, the pressure upon the blotter, the sheen of ink. Small irregularities betray fabrication. When events align too neatly, one must look for the hand that arranged them." He resumed his seat and reached for his violin. And a single clear note sounded, then another, weaving into a melody at once austere and resolute. I reflected then upon the strange duality of my friend, his apparent detachment masking a profound, if rarely expressed, commitment to justice. He would deny sentiment, yet he labored unceasingly to ensure that the gallows claimed only the truly guilty. At length he lowered the bow. "Watson," he said quietly, "should you ever recount this affair, emphasize not my deductions but the lesson it offers. Let no man be condemned upon the convenience of a narrative. Scrutinize the smallest detail, for there lies the safeguard against error." I promised him that I would. Thus concluded the case which I have titled "The Lie That Sent an Innocent Man to the Gallows." It stands among the most sobering of my experiences with Sherlock Holmes, not for the complexity of its puzzle alone, but for the narrow margin by which truth prevailed. Even now, when I pass through a courtroom or glimpse the black scaffold in some illustrated broadsheet, I recall the crushed chrysanthemum upon the gravel and the faint metallic sheen of altered ink. In those trifles lay a man's salvation and the enduring proof that, however artfully constructed, falsehood cannot withstand the patient gaze of reason. In the quiet days that followed the trial, when the public excitement had subsided and Brookside House stood shuttered beneath the dull November sky, Holmes appeared to cast the matter from his active mind. Yet I, who had long observed the subtler workings of his intellect, knew that a case was never fully relinquished until its moral and mechanical elements alike had been reconciled. And it was upon a chill evening, as we sat before the fire in Baker Street, that I ventured to remark upon the curious symmetry of the affair. "You trace the lie from ink to motive," I said, "and from motive to act. There seems little left unresolved." Holmes, who had been gazing into the flames with half-lidded eyes, stirred slightly. "On the contrary, my dear Watson, resolution is not merely the exposure of guilt, but the comprehension of how error so nearly triumphed." He leaned forward, steepling his long fingers. "Let us retrace the logical spine of the matter, for therein lies its true instruction." I settled myself with notebook in hand, for I sensed that he spoke less for his own satisfaction than for mine, and perhaps for that future reader to whom these pages might one day appeal. "The affair presented itself," Holmes continued, "as complete. A quarrel publicly known, a written confession discovered beside the body, a witness placing the accused at the scene, motive, opportunity, admission, 3 pillars upon which any jury would confidently rest." "And yet," I interjected, "you found fault in their very completeness." "Precisely. Crime committed in passion is irregular. Crime committed in calculation contains flaw, where the calculation exceeds necessity. The confession was too convenient. It supplied not merely responsibility, but moral justification. He deserved death." That phrase rang false, for it echoed sentiment rather than fact. He rose and crossed to the desk, retrieving from a drawer the copies of the altered confession and Lady Margaret's writing. "Observe again the pressure of the pen," he said. Crow's original strokes were steady, indignant perhaps, but unafraid. The appended lines bore the hesitation of one assuming another's voice. From that discrepancy sprang doubt. From doubt, inquiry. "And the chrysanthemum?" I asked. "A trifle, yet decisive. Objects displaced without explanation are silent witnesses. The fallen bloom spoke of movement across the desk at a time when only the murderer remained. The soil upon the sill contradicted the gardener's narrative. Each small inconsistency eroded the facade." Holmes returned to his chair. "But beyond mechanics lies character. Lady Margaret's error was not solely in altering ink, but in underestimating the resilience of truth. She relied upon probability, the likelihood that no one would scrutinize minutiae when a confession lay ready. She judged society correctly in that respect, and she misjudged the presence of a single mind disposed to question. There was no arrogance in the statement, only clarity." "Do you believe," I ventured, "that she felt remorse?" Holmes considered before replying. "In the instant after the act, perhaps, yet remorse competes poorly with fear. Her subsequent conduct was governed not by grief but by preservation." A log shifted in the grate, sending a brief shower of sparks upward. "And Crow?" I asked softly. Holmes' expression grew reflective. "Crow's failing was opposite in nature. He trusted that justice, left to itself, would discern truth. That is a dangerous faith. Institutions operate upon evidence presented, not upon innocence presumed." He lifted his violin but did not yet play. "This case, Watson, illustrates a delicate principle, that when narrative coherence aligns too perfectly with expectation, one must suspect design. The lie that nearly sent Crow to the gallows was persuasive because it required no imagination. It satisfied public appetite for swift conclusion." "And you disrupted that appetite," I said. "For a time," he replied lightly, "until the next sensational headline." He drew the bow across the strings, coaxing forth a low, contemplative melody. As I watched him, I reflected upon the paradox of his nature. Outwardly detached, yet inwardly compelled by an austere devotion to reason. He sought neither acclaim nor gratitude. Indeed, he seemed faintly irritated by both. What animated him was the restoration of logical balance where distortion had intruded. At length he lowered the instrument. "You will write this case," he said. "So I shall." Then concluded thus, that a lie, however artfully constructed, contains within itself the seeds of exposure. It must account for every detail, whereas truth need only be itself. The smallest neglected fragment, a smear of soil, a metallic sheen of ink, may unravel the grandest deception. He rose and moved toward the window. Outside, the fog drifted thinly, revealing the lamplight along Baker Street and the dim outlines of passing figures. "London will produce other mysteries," he said quietly. "Some trivial, some grave. But remember, Watson, when next you encounter certainty too swiftly attained, pause. For the gallows is patient, and error, once consummated, admits no remedy." With that, he turned back into the warm glow of our rooms, his features once more composed in that familiar mask of sardonic calm. And thus ended the case in which a single altered sentence had nearly cost a man his life. It remains to me a sobering testament to the necessity of scrutiny and to the singular mind that, by attending to the faintest deviation, restored justice where falsehood had almost prevailed.